Every human alive today carries the same genetic scar, a bottleneck so narrow that our entire species may have dropped below 2,000 individuals. Something nearly deleted us. The crater it left behind is a hole in the ground you can see from space, and it is not the only time a mountain opened and a people vanished inside it. The ground remembers. Number 10. Lake Toba. A single eruption came within a breath of deleting the entire human species. Some estimates place the survivors below the population of a small town. 74,000 years ago, the ground in what is now northern Sumatra split open. Not a crack, not a vent. A wound roughly 60 miles long and 20 miles wide. The eruption ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pumice into the atmosphere, enough material to bury the entire Indian subcontinent under a blanket half a meter thick. The sound would have been heard across the Indian Ocean if anyone had been alive to hear it. The sky went black from East Africa to the South China Sea. Day turned to twilight, and twilight did not end. The world after Toba was unrecognizable. Global temperatures dropped by an estimated 3 to 5 degrees Celsius and stayed there for up to a decade. Vegetation died back across the tropics. River systems shrank. The animals that humans hunted, the gazelle, the wildebeest, the species that had fed our ancestors for 100,000 years, retreated to shrinking pockets of surviving grassland, and the humans followed them, or they starved. The ash settled in visible layers, a white stripe running through deep-sea sediment cores pulled from the floor of the Indian Ocean, still there today, still sharp, like a scar across the planet's skin. Then comes the crack in the record. Geneticists studying mitochondrial DNA noticed something strange in the human lineage. Somewhere between 60 and 70,000 years ago, the diversity of our species collapses to a thread. The trail of maternal lines narrows so dramatically that the most widely cited models place the entire breeding population of Homo sapiens at between 2,000 and 10,000 individuals. Toba. The competing theories arrive quickly, and they do not agree. Some researchers argue the bottleneck predates the eruption, that human populations were already thin, scattered in small pockets across Africa, and that Toba simply made a bad situation worse. Others point to more recent genetic analyses suggesting the collapse was less severe than early models claim, that the bottleneck signature might reflect migration patterns rather than near extinction. A few argue the climate impact has been overstated, that pockets of survivors rode out the worst in coastal refuges where the ash was thinner. But none of them erase the coincidence. The largest eruption in 2.5 million years, the narrowest point in the human genetic record, the same window in deep time. You can reject the severity. You can debate the numbers. What you cannot do is stand at the edge of Lake Toba, a body of water 60 miles long, filling a hole that a mountain used to occupy, and feel anything other than the weight of what almost happened. If the magma chamber had held just a little more pressure, the story of our species ends on a dark Sumatran hillside. No agriculture, no cities, no writing, no one left to wonder what happened. We are here because enough of us survived the longest darkness our lineage has ever endured, and even that survival was close enough to leave a mark in every cell of every person now living. What Toba nearly finished, another eruption accomplished against a different species of human. At number 9, Thera. They built a civilization with paved streets and running water, and then the island beneath them simply ceased to exist. Subscribe before we go any deeper. What comes next is the reason this video exists. The Minoans had something the rest of the Bronze Age world did not. Multi-story buildings with interior plumbing. Frescoes painted in colors that still vibrate 3,000 years later. A trade network that stretched from the Nile Delta to the coast of Spain. And at the center of it all, on the volcanic island of Thera in the Aegean Sea, a city called Akrotiri, prosperous, organized, alive. Then the mountain under the city woke up. The eruption that followed was one of the most violent in recorded history. The blast ejected an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. A column of pumice and ash rose 25 miles into the sky, collapsing under its own weight again and again, sending surges of superheated gas and rock down the flanks of the island. The island's center collapsed into the sea, forming a caldera, a ring of cliffs where a mountain had stood. Megatsunamis radiated outward across the Aegean, some estimated at over 100 feet, striking the coast of Crete within hours. The ports were smashed. The fleet was gone. The maritime spine of Minoan power was broken in a single morning. The world of the Minoans was gone, not conquered, not abandoned, deleted. Akrotiri was buried under 60 meters of volcanic debris, sealed so completely that when archaeologists found it 3.5 millennia later, the wooden beams of the buildings were still in place. The pottery was still on the shelves. The table was still set for dinner. A jar of olives sat where someone had left it. The ash had hardened around the furniture like stone, preserving the shape of chairs and tables and beds that had not been touched since the day the mountain exploded. But here is the crack. The people were not found. No bodies in Akrotiri. No remains in the streets. The evacuation had been orderly. The eruption gave warning and they left. But where they went and what happened to them after the tsunami struck is a gap that has never been closed. The theories try to fill it. Some argue the Minoan civilization was already in decline, that Thera accelerated a collapse already underway. Others say the eruption's destruction was localized, that the real blow came from Mycenaean invasion decades later. A persistent few connect the Thera event to Plato's Atlantis, a lost civilization swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. The evidence for that is thin, but the feeling behind it is not. A city that advanced should not have been on a volcanic island in the first place. It should not have been buried in an afternoon, and the people who fled should not have simply dissolved into the historical record without a trace. The only thing we know for certain is that they left. Everything after that is silence. They had time to leave. They left, and then they were never seen again. But Thera erased a civilization that had a name. Further north, something erased a civilization that had no writing to leave one behind. Coming in at number 8. Mount Tambora. It killed more people after it stopped erupting than during. The year that followed was the closest the modern world has come to mass deletion by starvation. In April of 1815, Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in Indonesia began to erupt. The explosion was the largest in recorded human history. It ejected roughly 100 cubic kilometers of rock and ash. The blast was heard 1,000 miles away in Sumatra. The immediate death toll on Sumbawa and the neighboring island of Lombok is estimated at 10 to 12,000 killed by pyroclastic flows, ash fall, and the tsunamis the eruption triggered. But the eruption itself was only the beginning. The real killer was what came after. Tambora injected an enormous volume of sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere. Over the following months, the particles spread across the globe, reflecting sunlight back into space. The year 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 3 degrees. In New England, frost hit the crops in June. In Ireland, rain fell without stopping for 142 days. In Central Europe, rivers flooded and harvests failed from France to Switzerland. The crack widens in the body count. The famine that followed killed far more than the eruption itself. On Sumbawa, the local population was nearly exterminated, not by fire, but by starvation and disease in the months after the ash settled. Across the northern hemisphere, an estimated 70 to 100,000 additional deaths are attributed to the crop failures and the epidemics that followed. Cholera spread through the contaminated water. Typhus moved through the displaced populations. In Switzerland, the summer was so cold and wet that Mary Shelley, trapped indoors by the weather, wrote Frankenstein, a story about a creator who could not control what he had made. She did not know the real creator of her misery was a volcano on the other side of the world. Then, a century and a half later, researchers dug into the volcanic deposits on Sumbawa and found the remains of a kingdom. Houses still furnished, bronze artifacts, the carbonized remnants of cloth and wood, a culture that had been extinguished so thoroughly that even its name had been forgotten, preserved only by the same ash that had buried it alive. The theories try to make sense of the scope. Some historians argue the global death toll has been inflated, that the climate disruption was real, but the famine deaths cannot all be traced to a single volcano. Others point out that Tambora was not acting alone. There had been several years of unusual cold before the eruption, suggesting broader atmospheric shifts already in progress. But the kingdom of Tambora is gone. Its language is gone. Its people are gone. The eruption buried the entire culture, houses, tools, household goods, all preserved under the ash like a darker version of Pompeii, but without the casts of bodies to mark where the living had stood. The civilization that existed on that mountainside is known only by the gap it left behind. And this one, devastating as it was, barely makes the top half. The deletions ahead are older, deeper, and much harder to explain. Mount Ilopango. It buried Maya settlements under 30 feet of white ash. The corn is still in the storehouses. In the early 6th century, in what is now El Salvador, the volcano Ilopango erupted with a force that reshaped the entire landscape. The blast deposited a layer of white volcanic ash, later named the Tierra Blanca Joven, across thousands of square kilometers. The ash was thick enough to extinguish every settlement in the Central Valley. Every field, every road, every building, buried under a sterile white blanket that would not support plant life for decades. The Maya were here, not the towering cities of the classic period, those came later, but settled agricultural communities with ceramics, trade networks, and cultivated maize stretching back centuries. They built platforms and plazas, they carved jade, they traded obsidian across hundreds of kilometers. The ash layer that Ilopango left behind is so complete that archaeologists can read the erasure in the soil. Below the white stripe, signs of habitation, pottery, hearths. Storage pits with carbonized corn still inside. Above it, nothing. A gap. A silence in the archaeological record that lasts generations. The soil itself had to be rebuilt from the ash before anything could grow again, and that took decades. The crack is in the corn. The storage pits found beneath the Tierra Blanca Joven ash still hold maize, carbonized but identifiable, preserved by the very heat that destroyed the people who stored it. The grain was never eaten. The harvest was never collected. The people who filled those storehouses were not there when the ash settled, and they did not come back. Picture it. A valley of farms and villages, the air thick with the smell of cooking maize and wood smoke, children playing between the platforms, traders arriving with jade and obsidian from the highlands. Then a sound, not thunder, not an earthquake, something without a name, and the sky turns white. Not dark, white. The ash falls like snow, except it is warm and it does not melt and it does not stop. The breathing becomes impossible. The eyes burn. And then the silence. What is not contested is the violence of the event itself. The Tierra Blanca Joven deposit is one of the thickest and most extensive ash layers in all of Central American volcanology, a geological signature so large it rewrote the map. And the ash itself is still there. 30 feet of sterile white stone covering what was once a lived-in landscape. The corn is still in the ground. The people are not. What Ilopango did to the Maya, another eruption may have done to an entire species, one that had walked the earth 4 times longer than we have. Down to number 6. Companion ignimbrite. An entire species of humans survived for 400,000 years, and in the shadow of this eruption they were gone. The Neanderthals were here, then they weren't. 39,000 years ago, the Phlegrean Fields, a vast volcanic caldera west of what is now Naples, erupted. The Companion ignimbrite was not a single explosion, but a sustained, apocalyptic release of magma and gas that produced pyroclastic flows racing across the landscape at hundreds of kilometers per hour. The deposits it left behind cover thousands of square kilometers of southern Italy. In places, the ignimbrite sheet is over 100 meters thick. The Neanderthals had lived in Europe for roughly 400,000 years before this. They had survived ice ages that turned the continent into tundra. They had hunted mammoth and aurochs across the steppes. They had buried their dead and crafted tools from stone and bone. They had adapted to cold that would kill a modern human in hours. They were not fragile. They were not a failed species waiting to be replaced. They were the longest enduring humans Europe had ever known, and they had endured through disasters that would have erased a lesser species entirely. Then the Phlegraean fields opened. The crack is in the timing. The Campanian ignimbrite eruption coincides almost exactly with the period in which Neanderthal populations disappear from the European fossil record. The ash blanketed the Mediterranean. Climate models suggest a volcanic winter lasting years, possibly decades. The ecosystems the Neanderthals depended on, the game they followed, the forests they sheltered in, were devastated across a range that covered most of their remaining territory. Gone. The theories crowd in, and most of them look past the volcano. The dominant explanation for Neanderthal extinction is competition with Homo sapiens, that modern humans outcompeted, outbred, or directly displaced them. Others point to climate change, arguing that rapid warming episodes at the end of the last ice age compressed the cold-adapted ecosystems Neanderthals relied on. Disease has been proposed. Interbreeding, absorption rather than extinction, has its advocates. But the eruption sits in the record like a deadline. Southern Italy was Neanderthal territory. The Phlegraean fields were in the middle of it. The ash layer and the disappearance line up. And after the ignimbrite, the archaeological signal of Neanderthal presence in the region does not recover. It stops. If the Campanian ignimbrite deleted the Neanderthals, it did not just end a population. It ended 400,000 years of continuous human occupation. The tools they made, the methods they developed, the knowledge they carried, all of it went into the ash, and the species that replaced them would not even know they had existed for another 170 centuries. A lineage older than our own entire history as Homo sapiens, gone in a season of fire and silence. Everything so far has been the shallow water. From here on, the floor drops out. Because if an eruption can delete a species, it can also delete the memory of the people who were there. Number 5. Mount Pinatubo. For 18 months, the sun did not shine at full brightness anywhere on Earth, and for 1,500 years, nobody could explain why. In the year 536 AD, the Byzantine historian Procopius recorded something he could not account for. The sun, he wrote, gave forth its light without brightness like the moon all year long. Shadows disappeared at noon. Crops failed. Frost struck in summer. From Ireland to China, independent records confirm the same thing, a dimming of the sun that lasted at least 18 months, followed by the coldest decade in 2,000 years of tree-ring data. The Irish annals recorded a failure of bread. The Chinese chronicles described yellow dust falling from the sky and frost in August. In Mesopotamia, a contemporary inscription speaks of the gods withholding the sky. The cause was a mystery for 15 centuries. Then in the late 20th century, ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica began yielding answers. Sulfate spikes in the ice layers corresponding to the mid-530s pointed unmistakably to a massive volcanic eruption. But which volcano? The candidates were debated for decades. An Icelandic eruption, Ilopango, a volcano in the tropics. Each theory had evidence. Each had problems. In 2019, a study of ice cores from Kal Nifty in the Swiss Alps refined the picture. The volcanic sulfur signature pointed not to Iceland but to a tropical eruption, and the chemistry of the ash particles recovered from the ice narrowed the field. The debate has not been fully resolved, but a growing body of evidence points to a massive eruption, possibly from the region of what is now the Philippines, that injected enough sulfate into the stratosphere to dim the sun across the entire planet. The crack is in what the darkness did. The 530s were already a brutal century. The Roman Empire was in terminal decline. Plague was moving through the Mediterranean. The climate disruption from the volcanic winter made it worse, much worse. Crop failures across the northern hemisphere, famine from Scandinavia to Mesopotamia, political instability in the Byzantine and Persian empires. Some historians have argued that the eruption of 536 set in motion a chain of events that reshaped the balance of power across the ancient world. The theories still disagree on the volcano. The Icelandic candidate has strong ice core support. Ilopango has been proposed and contested. The tropical source, possibly in the Philippines, has gained ground in recent years, but remains unconfirmed by a definitive ash fingerprint. But the darkness itself is not in dispute. The tree rings confirm it. The ice confirms it. The historical records confirm it. For a year and a half, the sun was wrong, and the people who lived through it had no way to know why, only that the world had changed and the warmth was not coming back. The year the sun went dark is one kind of horror. The eruption that left no witnesses at all is another. At number 4, Toba. It was the most violent eruption on Earth in 5,000 years. It sterilized everything within 90 miles, and we have almost no idea who was living there. The Hape eruption of the Toba volcano in New Zealand occurred roughly 1,800 years ago. It was not the largest eruption in geologic history, but it was the most violent in the last 5 millennia. The blast was so powerful that it generated a pyroclastic flow that traveled at near supersonic speeds, obliterating everything in a radius of over 90 kilometers. Forests, rivers, hills, all consumed. The ash plume rose higher than 30 kilometers into the atmosphere, punching through the tropopause and spreading a blanket of pumice across the Pacific. The deposits it left behind cover the entire central North Island, a layer of pumice and ignimbrite so thick that in places it erased the pre-existing topography entirely. Where there had been valleys, there were flat plains of ash. Where there had been hills, there were voids. The world the eruption struck was not empty. New Zealand had been settled by Polynesian navigators, the ancestors of the Maori, at some point in the centuries before the eruption. The exact timing of their arrival is one of the most debated questions in Pacific archaeology. Some evidence points to settlement as early as the late 13th century, but recent discoveries have pushed the date further back, and older habitation layers may yet lie beneath the ash. The landscape around Lake Taupo shows signs of human presence predating the Hape deposits. Charcoal, tools, the remains of earth ovens. People were here. The crack is in what the eruption removed. The blast zone was sterilized so completely that nothing survived, not the forests, not the soil, not the people. And because the eruption destroyed the very ground the evidence rested on, the archaeological record of who was living in the blast zone is simply gone. Not buried, deleted. The pyroclastic flow did not seal the remains under a preserving layer of ash, the way Thera preserved Akrotiri. It incinerated them. The theories are few because the evidence is thin. Some archaeologists argue that the central North Island may have been only sparsely populated at the time, that the death toll was relatively small. Others point to oral traditions among Maori iwi that reference catastrophic events, fire from the mountain, the death of the forest, as possible cultural memories of the eruption. But the traditions are fragmentary, and the archaeology is missing. The eruption at Taupo did not just delete a landscape. It deleted the record of who was in it. The ground was rebuilt from nothing, new soil, new forest, new growth over old absence. And the people who were there before are a gap in a story that starts over with ash. Taupo deleted a landscape so thoroughly that even the memory of who was there vanished. But one mountain deleted itself so completely that only a hole remained, and the people who survived told the story for 9,000 years. Down to number 3. Mount Mazama. The mountain erased itself so completely that only water remained. and the people who lived beneath it passed down an account so precise that geologists confirmed every detail 9,000 years later. 7,700 years ago, Mount Mazama stood in what is now southern Oregon. It was a 12,000-foot stratovolcano, one of the great peaks of the Cascade Range. Below it, the Klamath people had lived for generations. They knew the mountain. They hunted its slopes. They gathered huckleberries in its meadows. They gave it a name, the home of Lao, the god of the underworld. Then the mountain came apart. The eruption was colossal, 42 times the volume of the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption. The magma chamber beneath Mazama emptied so completely that the entire summit collapsed into the void, forming a caldera nearly 6 miles across. The ash plume reached 30 miles into the atmosphere, depositing pumice across the Pacific Northwest in a layer that geologists can trace for hundreds of miles in every direction. When the ash settled, the mountain was gone. Where 12,000 feet of rock and snow had stood, there was nothing but a hole in the ground. Rain and snowmelt filled it over centuries. Crater Lake. The Klamath people who survived told the story. In their oral tradition, the eruption was the climax of a battle between Lao, the god of the underworld who lived inside the mountain, and Skel, the god of the sky who descended from the heights above. Lao hurled fire and rock from the summit. Skel drove him back. The mountain collapsed. The fire stopped. The water came. Still there. The crack is in the accuracy. When geologists mapped the eruption deposits in the 20th century, they found that the Klamath account matched the physical evidence in nearly every particular. The direction of the blast, the collapse of the summit, the formation of the caldera, the timing of the water filling the basin. The story had been passed down orally for approximately 7,700 years, and it was right. The theories try to explain how. Some researchers suggest the tradition was reinforced by the ongoing visibility of Crater Lake itself, that each generation saw the evidence and the story was updated to match. Others argue that the specificity of the Klamath account, the battle sequence, the direction of the flows, the collapse, goes beyond what simple observation of a caldera could provide, and that it must represent a direct cultural memory passed from witnesses to descendants over hundreds of generations. The mountain is gone. The water took its place, and the story is all that survived, carried by word of mouth across a span of time longer than all of recorded history, told by people who could not have known they were preserving geology, only that they were preserving what they had seen. And yet, for all that survival, something far more unsettling lies ahead. An eruption so remote that the people it deleted have no names, no stories, and no one left to remember them. Number 2. Aniakchak. It erupted with a force that turned the horizon to fire for 600 miles, in one of the most remote places on Earth. Nobody was there to record who was deleted. That is the point. 3,600 years ago, on the Alaska Peninsula, Mount Aniakchak erupted with a violence that is difficult to overstate. The blast created a caldera 6 miles across and 2,000 feet deep. The pyroclastic flows sterilized the surrounding landscape for miles. Ash fell in measurable quantities across an area of more than 1 million square kilometers. Pumice rafts floated in the Pacific. The horizon burned from 600 miles away. The world of the Alaska Peninsula was remote, then as now. But it was not empty. The Aleutian Corridor had been inhabited for thousands of years before the eruption. The people who lived along the coast were marine hunters and fishers, adapted to one of the harshest environments on the planet, and living in small, mobile communities that left only the lightest archaeological footprint. They built houses from driftwood and whalebone. They hunted seal and walrus from skin boats. They passed knowledge from generation to generation in a landscape that allowed no mistakes. They were survivors, and then the ground opened beneath them. The crack is not in what was found. It is in what was not found. Aniakchak's blast zone covers such an enormous area in such an inaccessible region that systematic archaeological survey has barely begun. The eruption was total enough, hot enough, fast enough, sustained enough to delete every trace of habitation within its radius. Not bury, delete. The pyroclastic flows did not coat the settlements in preserving ash. They erased them. The evidence, if it existed, was vaporized along with the soil it rested in. Nobody. The theories are not really theories. They are the absence of them. Some archaeologists assume the area was sparsely populated and the death toll was small, but that assumption is based on the lack of evidence, not the presence of it. The blast zone has not been excavated because the blast zone is one of the most difficult terrains on the continent to reach. The truth is that we simply do not know how many people were living within 60 miles of Aniakchak when it erupted. We do not know what their communities looked like. We do not know what they knew. That is the deepest deletion. Not a civilization with a name and a history that was cut short. Not a people whose story survived in oral tradition. A people who were removed so completely that their absence is indistinguishable from never having been there at all. The caldera is beautiful now, a lake inside a volcano, ringed by green, visited by the occasional researcher. But the beauty is a mask. What lies beneath it is an erasure so total that even the question of who was erased cannot be answered. Aniakchak deleted people we will never name. The last eruption on this list deleted people we can still see, still standing, still wearing the expressions they wore in the last second of their lives. Number 1, the one you came for. Mount Vesuvius. They had time to leave. Most of them didn't. When the city was found 17 centuries later, the people were still standing where they fell. In the autumn of 79 AD, the exact date is debated, but the most recent evidence points to late October. Mount Vesuvius erupted after centuries of dormancy. The initial explosion sent a column of pumice and ash 12 miles into the sky. It fell on Pompeii for hours, piling up on rooftops until the weight collapsed the buildings. Then the column itself collapsed, and the first pyroclastic surge swept down the mountain at over 400 miles per hour. Herculaneum was closest. The surge hit the seaside town first. Those who had fled to the boat houses on the beach were killed instantly by heat exceeding 500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to vaporize organic tissue, hot enough to fuse the ash into a hard shell around the space where a body had been. Their flesh vanished. Their bones remained, still clustered in the arcades where they had waited for rescue that never came. Some were still holding their valuables. Some were still holding each other. Pompeii was further. The first surge lost momentum before reaching the city walls, and for a few hours the residents may have believed they were safe. But the second did not stop. By morning, Pompeii was buried under 9 feet of ash. The people who had stayed, who had chosen to shelter in their homes rather than flee through the falling pumice, were sealed inside, not killed by the initial blast, entombed by the weight of the sky collapsing on top of them. 17 centuries later, the city was found, not the ruin, the city. The ash had hardened into a shell that preserved the shape of everything inside: the streets, the buildings, the graffiti on the walls, the bread still in the ovens. And when the ash was chipped away from the voids where bodies had decomposed, the spaces were filled with plaster. The casts that emerged were not skeleton, they were people, in the positions they died in, reaching for each other, covering their mouths, holding children. A dog still twisted in its chain. The crack is in the faces, not the bones, the faces. The ash preserved the impression of skin and clothing with enough fidelity that the casts show expression, not agony in most cases, but surprise. The ordinary look of someone who has just realized the world is not what they thought it was. The theories try to reconstruct the timeline. Some argue the residents of Pompeii could not have escaped even if they tried, that the first surge arrived faster than anyone could have run. Others point to the fact that many did escape, that the death toll in Pompeii was a fraction of the population, that the people found in the ash were those who chose to stay or could not move. Pliny the Younger, who watched the eruption from across the bay and later wrote the only surviving eyewitness account, described his uncle sailing toward the mountain to rescue people and dying in the fumes. The decision to go toward the disaster rather than away from it was the last one he made. The people in the ash did not scream. The heat killed them before the signal could reach their vocal cords. They were alive, and then they were not, and the ash sealed the moment so precisely that we can still see the shape of their final breath. Faces, not ghosts, not bones. People arrested in the last second they were alive, in a city that was buried before the news of its destruction could reach Rome. The eruption did not delete their memory. It did something worse. It preserved them in the act of being deleted and left them there, standing in the dark for 1,700 years. 300 miles beneath Yellowstone, something is stirring. The ground has risen. The lake is shifting. The last time it erupted, it buried half a continent in ash. It is overdue.